Hey y'all, and welcome back to another episode of Thinking and Drinking. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the ways that language and our unseen personal baggage affects our social interactions, and I'll be featuring some input from one of my favorite stone-cold weirdos of philosophy. So sit back, relax, pour yourself a beverage, and let's get to it. Before we get to today's business, a small note from social media. I would not dream of taking credit for the content that appears on a fairly well-known person's social media feed. I don't have that level of hubris, and to be honest, the probability of it is incredibly unlikely. But I will say that I was having a terrible day yesterday, and seeing pictures of an adorably fluffy dog, as well as reading about the mechanics needed to keep the buns toned. That did not go unappreciated. And speaking of toning the buns, this reminds me of a story from my time in the military. I was stationed in Texas for a fair amount of time, and there was a gentleman who led our workout groups from time to time. He was tallish, a bit windburnt, a silver glove boxer, and what I remember the most about him is that he had a unique idea for a quick exercise that anyone can do at any time if they want to keep their glutes firm. And my apologies for anybody who actually knows which individual to whom I'm referring, but these are his words, his advice, more or less his accent. Listen up, folks. Here's a bit of advice for any of you who want to tone your glutes, but you don't think you have the equipment. You can do this exercise anywhere that you have some time. If you're stuck in traffic, if you're waiting at line in the bank, maybe you're sitting at your desk doing your work. Here's what you can do. Squeeze them butt cheeks. And now that I've got that image in your mind, let's move along. I mentioned the working title of this episode to my friend Griff, and there was silence on his end for a bit, and then he said, "I sense fuckery." Here's something to note. If you've been around me for a while, you know that there is always fuckery afoot. And if you didn't know that, you do now. Let's see here. Now on to the actual serious body of what we're going to be talking about. As some of you might recall, I'm doing my graduate studies in rhetoric, more specifically the way it affects people, the way that people use language in order to communicate with each other in certain settings, like social media. To put it another way, it's a blend between the symbolic, semiotic aspects of the way that we communicate and the unique functions, the pragmatics, of the words that we use. My advisor has recommended that, knowing my fortitude for dealing with the ideological salvos of cranky German philosophers, that I dip my toes into the pool of what Nietzsche has to say about rhetoric. I will in a little bit, but I have seen the eldritch horrors that swirl beneath the surface of that pool, and I want to make sure that I have appropriately prepared myself before proceeding. That said, you can barely toss a schnitzel into the field of Teutonic philosophers without hitting someone who has a very strong opinion about language. Or, for that matter, well, about anything. If you're going to get into what these people have to say, here are a few tips. You'd best have a fairly good grasp of their ideological genealogy. That is to say, who taught them? Who were they inspired by? Because the moment you crack open a text by a German philosopher, or anyone from that area in Europe, you're going to notice something. They are going to drop some pretty hardcore ideas and some names at you, and then just run away without explaining it, because, by God, you should know what I'm talking about. For example, a year ago, I was doing a project for one of my classes that was an analysis of Fahrenheit 451, as recently redone by HBO, through the lens of Jürgen Habermas's theory of the marketplace of ideas. In order to really get a grip on Habermas, you need to be familiar with his teachers, Horkheimer and Adorno, and you also need to know, by that extent, who inspired them. That is to say, Karl Marx and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Gesundheit. All of these folks toss around some pretty heavy ideas, and, well, you just need to deal with it. Well, I've added another individual to my stable of cranky, opinionated Germanic thinkers, and that is Ludwig Wittgenstein. Everything that I've read and heard and learned about him leads me to believe that he was actually a stone-cold weirdo. He had a fondness for fjords, a lack of social aptitude, to the point of inviting a woman who was probably his fiancée to visit him in Norway, but he kept her at a marked distance, like miles away, and didn't even bother to visit her while she was there. He also had a distaste for teaching classes anywhere larger than, say, 6 students. And then let's not forget his knack of referring to himself in the third person when criticizing his earlier work. We also have him to thank for truth tables, and he's also known for being a cranky bastard who got so fed up with teaching math to grade school students that he resorted to corporal punishment. And he also may have once gone after his fellow philosopher Karl Popper with a fireplace poker. Yikes. Last but not least, I'd like to reference a certain famous photograph of Wittgenstein, which was taken in 1929 upon his receipt of a scholarship to study at Trinity College at Cambridge. Any grad student will take a look at this photo and will recognize the expression on his face as a whole-ass big mood. I'm not a psychologist, so I won't go so far as to explicitly say that dear old Ludwig was neurodivergent, but as someone who is diagnosed with Asperger's as an adult, I look at records of some of his attitudes and behaviors and I think, dude, same. Granted, I have marginally better social adjustment, and even though some of the academic ideas I hear make me want to beat their creators over the head with a folding chair, WWE style, I can restrain myself. However, that's because I'm well aware of my decreased physical conditioning, and I'm also aware of the fact that the only attributes that I bring to a fight are my body mass, my surprising agility, my knack for improvised weapons, and the element of surprise. So there's that. Wittgenstein's ideas about language are interesting to me in that they step away from a mechanical view of communication and instead attempt to grasp the fluidity and the evolutionary nature of language. Yeah, he may have been a stone-cold weirdo with marginal social graces, and he may have called some of his students useless, but his later observations about social interactions and their effects on language were spot on. In his doctoral thesis, the Tractatus Philosophicus, Wittgenstein discussed words as symbols, pictures, if you will, representing the ideas that their user seeks to express. In his later work, he denounces the author of the Tractatus, namely himself, as being incorrect, and instead says that the meaning and functions of words depends on the situation in which they're being used, and also who's using them. This sounds like a good time to say, well, no shit. But it only seems that way because if you're not a huge-ass nerd who goes way too hard on questions of language theory, it's something that you've grown accustomed to without really thinking about why it is the way it is. Also, it's not just the meanings of words themselves that Wittgenstein sought to clarify. How many of you have faced a brand new social situation and have rehearsed in your mind precisely how you're going to behave and speak? How many times did it go exactly the way that you thought it was going to go? Odds are that it went in a completely different direction. And, well, Wittgenstein's idea of language games offers a theoretical concept as for why. And here it is. Each one of us carries our own set of metaphorical baggage that affects the way we think, act, and interact with other people. It ranges on things from a micro level, like our daily experiences, to a macro level, like the societies and groups that we travel in. All of these influences help us to write our own inner rules for social interactions. The issue is, everyone else has their own unique individual rules of communication, and you don't know what their rules are until you actually interact with them. And here's another thing. The pain of it all is that these rules can change from moment to moment. For example, think of a moment when a friend of yours, they're normally pretty easygoing to deal with because you've known them for a while, but something happens and they just erupt in this volcano of molten hot bitch. Well, you're not used to that, and you think, what the hell did I do? You have to figure out whether you actually did do anything or not, and then figure out how to proceed from there. That is the very dynamic nature of an individual's set of language rules. This might all seem painfully obvious, but it works towards explaining why certain social interactions just don't work also. Odds are you just haven't figured out how to mesh your own personal communication rules with the others being used in play. So here we're going to go into a bit deeper level of nerd. I'm going to give credit where credit is due to my current philosophy professor, Dr. Kevin Decker, for coming up with an amazing pop culture reference for this. He's really good at that. For those of you familiar with Star Trek: The Next Generation, or for the very least with sci-fi meme culture, there's a phrase that illustrates the concept of language games quite well. Say it with me if you know it. Shaka, when the walls fell. In the episode where this comes from, Darmok, Captain Picard must ally with an alien captain in order to survive in a hostile environment. However, even though he can understand the words themselves being used, thanks to the universal translator, to him they make no sense at all because he's unfamiliar with this alien's culture and how they use historical and, cultural metaphors in order to describe the situations that they currently experience. Night falls, and Picard is having trouble building a fire. He also knows that he's probably going to freeze to death if he can't get warm. He is so frustrated, and the alien captain notices this. He sees that frustration, and he invokes that particular phrase, Shaka, when the walls fell, to describe a leader in his own culture's past being frustrated to the point of despondency with a no-win scenario. This is a pivotal point in which Picard begins to understand Dathon, the captain's seemingly incomprehensible words. Now, this may not seem that relatable if you haven't seen the show or if you're unfamiliar with sci-fi meme culture. But you know what? That's not a bad thing. It just means that your language rules and your background are different. So, what are we supposed to take from this overall? The lesson to be learned is that even though your language rules are different from that of other people, if you want to be a good global citizen, you need to make an effort to see where your rules can mesh, and more often than not, you need to be the person who makes the first effort to do it. Effective, functional communication requires cooperation, flexibility, and a certain amount of flexibility on the part of all people involved. Otherwise, it just really won't work. And that's all I've got for you today. Thanks for listening, and be sure to come back next week for another episode of Thinking and Drinking.